I remember the smell of bacta mixed with blood. That's what I remember first. Before the screaming, before the names I couldn't save, before I understood what it meant to be engineered for a war that would consume us all. The smell was sweet and metallic at once, like rust dissolved in medicine. And it clung to my armor, my gloves, my skin beneath the plastid soaking into me, until I couldn't tell where the battlefield ended and I began. They made us on Camino. That's where all the stories start, isn't it? In those white halls that stretched endward into nothing, where the rain never stopped, and the ocean never calmed, and we learned what we were before we learned who we could be. I was Psyche 7649. That was my designation. That was my name. That was everything I was supposed to need. But the Caminoans, in their cold efficiency, in their genetic calculations and accelerated growth chambers, they taught us one other thing they probably didn't intend. They taught us numbers. And when you know numbers, when you understand statistics and survival rates and triage protocols, you start to see the math of your own extinction. I was trained as a medic. Not chosen, trained. Assigned. Some flaw in my psychological profile, some tendency toward precision, or perhaps too much empathy for a weapon, marked me for the medical corps before I'd fired my first blaster in practice. While my brothers learned suppressing fire and flanking maneuvers, I learned anatomy. While they memorized kill zones, I memorized how to keep someone breathing when their chest had been opened by shrapnel. While they were taught to take ground, I was taught to hold it long enough to save whoever was still bleeding on it. The instructors were clinical. Caminoans don't understand compassion. They understand function. A medic exists to return damaged units to combat effectiveness. That's the phrase they used. Combat effectiveness. Not healing. Not saving. Returning assets to operational status. We practiced on training dummies first, then on each other during live fire exercises where the wounds were real but controlled, measured, designed to teach us exactly how much a clone could endure. I became very good at my function. They shipped us out when the war began. That great galaxy-spanning conflict that we were told would bring peace, would restore order, would save the Republic from forces that sought to tear it apart. I remember the transport, the first time, leaving Camino's storms behind and jumping through hyperspace toward a battle I couldn't yet imagine. We sat in rows, identical faces staring back at identical faces, and somewhere in that cramped hold, I realized that every single one of us was expendable. Not in the cruel way, in the mathematical way. We were products. We were inventory, and inventory can always be replenished. My first deployment was Geonosis. If you've never been to Geonosis, if you've never felt that red dust coat your throat or heard the insect-like chittering of its natives as they fired from their hives, then you can't understand what it means to learn war all at once, in a single brutal afternoon. The gunships descended through formations of droid fighters, and I watched through the viewport as clone transports around us exploded into brilliant flowers of flame, and I thought, with perfect clarity, we haven't even landed yet. When the doors opened, the heat hit me first. Geonosis burns. The sun beats down on that rust-colored wasteland like a hammer on an anvil, and the dust rises with every explosion, every footstep, every body that falls, until the air itself becomes a thing you have to fight through. I grabbed my med pack and followed my unit down the ramp, and within 30 seconds I was crouched behind a rock formation, trying to stop arterial bleeding in a trooper whose designation I never learned because he died before he could tell me. His blood was red. Exactly the same red as mine. Nishu Telnod. And that shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. The droids didn't bleed. That's what made them efficient. You could dismember them and they'd keep firing until you hit the central processor. We bled. We bled from every wound, every gap in our armor, every place where the galaxy could reach in and remind us we were made of flesh. And my Jobami sole purpose in that screaming chaos was to stop the bleeding long enough for them to bleed again somewhere else, on some other battlefield, in some other system we'd never heard of. I worked through the entire battle. I don't remember most of Edis. Trauma does that, compresses time into snapshots, moments of perfect clarity surrounded by fog. I remember a trooper with his legs severed below the knee, and the way he apologized to me, apologized, as if being wounded was a failure of duty. I remember running through open ground while blaster fire turned the dust into glass around my boots, dragging a wounded brother toward cover that didn't exist. I remember the sound odds, that soundation, of a man drowning in his own blood, and knowing that no amount of bacta or suction or desperate pressure could save him because the shrapnel had torn through too much, had destroyed too many vital systems. I lost count of how many I treated. I lost count of how many I lost. When the battle ended, when the separatist forces finally retreated, and we held that useless stretch of desert, I sat among the wounded and the dead, and I understood something the Kaminoans never taught me. We were winning. The Republic was winning. And we were dying to do it. They gave us 4 days before the next deployment. 4 days to rest, to repair our armor, to clean our weapons, to pretend we were anything other than tools waiting to be used again. The medical frigate where they housed us between battles was cold and efficient, all white walls and recycled air, and the constant hum of machinery. I spent those days in the med bay, helping with the wounded who'd survived long enough to reach the ship. And I learned the vocabulary of damage, degloving injuries, thermal burns, blunt force trauma, penetrating wounds, crush injuries, blast lung, traumatic amputation. I learned which injuries were survivable, and which ones meant you'd be sent to a rehabilitation center where they'd decide if you were worth repairing, or if you'd be reassigned to some support role, some quiet acknowledgement that you'd given enough. I learned that enough was a flexible concept, dependent on how desperately they needed bodies on the front lines. Some of my brothers talked during those 4 days. Tried to process what we'd seen, what we'd done. But most of us stayed quiet, locked inside ourselves, because speaking it aloud made it real in a way that we couldn't afford. I remember sitting in the mess hall, surrounded by identical faces eating identical rations, and wondering if this was what peace looked like. This hollow silence between screams. On the 5th day, they deployed us to Christophsis. Urban combat. DOS. Narrow streets and tall buildings and civilians caught in the crossfire. The droids had taken half the city, and we were supposed to take it back, street by street, building by building, body by body. I learned a new kind of medicine there, in those ruined streets, where the architecture itself became shrapnel. I learned how to treat civilians, no, because we were ordered to, but because they were there, bleeding, dying, looking at us with eyes that didn't understand why this war had come to their homes. A girl, maybe 8 years old, caught in an explosion. Both legs crushed. I worked on her in the shadow of a collapsed building while blaster fire echoed off the walls around us, and she didn't cry. She just stared at me with these huge, dark eyes, and I thought, she's going into shock. But she wasn't. She was just resigned, as if she'd already accepted that this was how the galaxy worked. Random, violent, incomprehensible. I saved her, got her stabilized, got her to an evac transport. I never learned what happened to her after that. Never learned if she survived the surgery, if she learned to walk on prosthetics, if she grew up hating clones for what we brought to her world. I just moved on to the next casualty, and the next, because that's what medics do. We don't get to follow up. We don't get to know if our work mattered. We just patch and pray and hope the person we saved doesn't die 5 minutes later. Christophsis lasted 3 weeks. No way. 3 weeks of fighting for every block, every building, every worthless piece of territory. We won. We always won. And in winning, we left behind mass graves of battle droids and clone troopers buried side by side, because there wasn't time to separate them properly. After Christophsis came Ryloth. After Ryloth came Kaminoa, defending our birthplace from an attack that felt like violation, like something sacred had been touched by profane hands. After Camino came Malastair, Felucia, Selokami, Magitia, worlds blurring together into a continuous stream of battle, blood, bacta, body bags. The names of planets became meaningless. They were just coordinates, just drop zones, just places where we'd land and fight, and bleed, and die and leave behind pieces of ourselves. I stopped counting deployments after the 15th. Maldio stopped counting brothers after the 100th. The numbers became too heavy to carry, but I never stopped counting the ones I lost on my table. The ones who died while I worked on them, while my hands were inside their bodies trying to hold together what explosions had torn apart. CT 4477, who bled out from a femoral artery wound because the shrapnel had severed it too close to the hip for me to clamp. CT 9204, who took a direct hit from a blaster cannon and was already dead when they brought him to me. But I worked on him anyway because stopping meant admitting he was gone. CT 2381, who died from an infection 3 days after I'd treated his wounds, because we ran out of antibiotics and the supply ship was delayed. I counted them. I remembered them, because someone had to. The Jedi led us. That's important to understand. We didn't fight alone. We had generals, commanders, leaders who could manipulate the Force itself, who could see paths through battle that we couldn't imagine. I served under General Imagundi on Ryloth, under General Palm Krell on Umbara, under others whose names and faces blur together now. Some of them were kind in their way, treated us like soldiers instead of equipment. Mwah. Others were cold, calculating, willing to spend our lives like currency to achieve their objectives. Krell was the worst. On Umbara, in those bioluminescent jungles where the darkness itself seemed alive, he ordered us into suicidal charges, refused air support, pushed us beyond any reasonable tactical limit. I treated the wounded from those assaults, and I saw the confusion in their eyes, not from trauma, but from disbelief. We were bred to follow orders, engineered to obey, but even we could see that something was wrong. That we were being wasted. That our deaths were serving some purpose we couldn't understand. When they finally revealed that Krell had betrayed us, that he'd been working against the Republic, it should have been shocking. But it wasn't. Blood. It just confirmed what we'd already known. Deep in that place where our programming couldn't quite reach. We were disposable. Even to those who commanded us. Even to those we were created to serve. The war changed after Umbara. Or maybe I changed. Maybe the war stayed exactly the same, and I just finally saw it clearly for the first time. Saw past the propaganda, and the brotherhood, and the nobility we told ourselves we were fighting for. We were meat. Highly trained, genetically optimized, perfectly obedient meat, fed into a grinder that stretched across the galaxy, and would keep grinding until there was nothing left to feed it. I started noticing things I'd been trained not to see. The way the officers say. Natural-born officers from Coruscant and other core worlds looked at us. Not with contempt exactly, but with a kind of comfortable distance, the way you'd look at a droid you knew would follow its programming. The way requisition forms listed us under military assets alongside AT-T and gunships. The way casualty reports reduced brothers I'd bled with, fought beside, tried desperately to save, into numbers on a spreadsheet. Losses acceptable, objectives achieved, recommend continued deployment. I met a civilian doctor once on a medical station near Ord Mantell. Dr. Suresh, her name Wasa, a Marayalan woman with the traditional facial tattoos of her people, and hands that had spent decades learning the craft of medicine in universities and hospitals across the Republic. She was part of a volunteer corps, helping to manage the overflow of wounded that the military medical system couldn't handle alone. We worked together for 6 days, treating casualties from a fleet engagement. And on the last day, she asked me a question that I still hear in the quiet moments. "How old are you?" I told her the truth. 8 standard years. She stared at me. Just stared. And in that silence I understood what she was seeing. A man who looked 30, who moved and spoke and thought like someone who'd lived a full adult life, trapped inside a body that had been artificially aged, artificially educated, artificially everything. I was 8 years old. Most of the brothers I'd watched die were younger. That's not possible, she whispered. The trauma you've experienced, the expertise you demonstrate, you can't have learned this in 8 years. But I had. Because we weren't given childhoods. We weren't given time to develop naturally, to make mistakes, to learn slowly the way organic beings are meant to learn. We were flash-trained, force-grown, programmed with information and skills and obedience, and then shipped to war zones where we'd use those skills until we died. The Kaminoans had created the perfect soldier, one who reached combat effectiveness in 1/10 of the time it took to train a natural born, and who cost less to replace than a starfighter. Dr. Suresh tried to hide it, but I saw the horror in her eyes. The moral collapse. She'd spent her entire life learning to save people, and now she was working beside child soldiers. Because that's what we were, regardless of how old our bodies looked at, who'd been bred for slaughter. She never asked me another personal question after that. But the way she looked at me changed, and I couldn't decide if that was better or worse than the comfortable distance of the officers. The war ground on. Year 2 became Year 3. The Republic pushed deeper into separatist space, and the casualty lists grew longer. And the replacements kept coming from Kamino at fresh batches of brothers who looked exactly like me. Exactly like the ones I'd watched die. Identical faces marching into identical fates. I learned to spot the new ones immediately. Nasha watched to Rebid Kanchrik. I only dies you were down to metal. They had this brightness in their eyes, this eagerness to prove themselves, to live up to the purpose they'd been created for. It usually lasted until their first real combat. After that, they looked like the rest of us, tired, hollow, moving through the motions because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant counting the dead. I requested a transfer at one point. Not away from combat. He knew that was impossible, knew that medics were too valuable, too necessary. But I requested assignment to a medical frigate, something that would let me treat wounded in a controlled environment instead of on battlefields, where I worked with one hand while holding a blaster in the other. The request was denied. Critical personnel, they said. Essential to frontline operations. Which meant, you're too good at keeping soldiers alive long enough to fight again, and we need that skill in the places where they're dying fastest. So I stayed on the front lines. Felucia, with its fungal forests that grew so dense you couldn't see the sky, and where wounded men would disappear into the undergrowth, consumed by the planet itself. Katonemoidia, fighting in the bridge cities suspended over bottomless chasms, where falling meant watching the ground rush toward you for long enough to understand you were already dead. Kashyyyk, where the Wookiees fought beside us, and I learned that other species had the capacity for grief that looked exactly like ours. That loss was universal, that pain transcended language. On Kashyyyk, I treated a Wookiee warrior who'd taken a thermal detonator blast meant for one of my brothers. Massive burns across his chest and left arm, fur scorched away, skin blackened and cracking. He was in agony. Wookiees have incredible pain tolerance, but this was beyond what any being should have to endure. And yet, he didn't make a sound. Just stared at me with these ancient, knowing eyes while I worked, while I pumped him full of painkillers and bacta, and tried to stabilize him for transport. He survived. I made sure of that. And when they evacuated him, when they carried him away on a repulsor stretcher, he reached out with his good hand and touched my helmet. Gentle, reverent, towel. A gesture of thanks that nearly broke me because it was so human, so full of recognition and gratitude. And I realized I couldn't remember the last time anyone had thanked me. We were supposed to serve. Thanks were irrelevant. But they weren't irrelevant. Not to me. Not anymore. I started keeping a log. Nothing official, that would have been against protocol, die. But in the quiet hours between battles, in the transport ships and barracks and aid stations, I wrote down names, designations, CT numbers of every brother I'd treated, whether they lived or died. I wrote down where they were wounded, what I'd done to try to save them, whether it had worked. I wrote down the ones who'd spoken to me, the last words of the ones who knew they were dying, the silence of the ones who'd gone into shock and slipped away before I could pull them back. The log grew. Hundreds of entries. Thousands. It became a ritual, a way of making their deaths mean something beyond the casualty reports. They'd been people. They'd had thoughts and fears and dreams that extended past their programming. Some wanted to see Coruscant. Some wanted to know what peace felt like. Some just wanted to survive long enough to understand why they'd been created in the first place. None of them got what they wanted. By the third year of the war, I could predict survival rates with unsettling accuracy. I could look at a wound and know within seconds whether the brother I was treating would make it to evac, would survive surgery, would ever return to combat. The human body, the Django Fett template that we all shared has limits, predictable limits. And after treating thousands of identical casualties, I knew exactly where those limits were. 15% blood loss, survivable with immediate intervention. 25%, critical, but possible with rapid transfusion. 35%, you're working on a corpse that doesn't know it yet. Blast damage to the torso, depends on what organs were hit, but if you see intestinal matter, you've got maybe 10 minutes before sepsis makes survival impossible. Head wounds, if they're still conscious, there's hope. If they're unconscious but breathing, even odds. If the breathing is irregular, say goodbye. Limb loss, entirely survivable. Assuming you can stop the bleeding and the shock doesn't kill them first. I became a calculator. A machine that processed trauma and output probabilities. It was the only way to function, the only way to triage effectively when you had 20 wounded brothers and supplies for 10, and had to choose who lived and who died based on cold mathematics. The worst were the ones I had to walk away from. The ones whose injuries were catastrophic but not immediately fatal, who would take hours to die, who I could maybe save if I devoted all my time and resources to them alone. But I couldn't, because 3 other brothers with survivable wounds would die in the time it took me to try. So I'd inject them with enough painkillers to make the end easier, and I'd move on, and I'd hear them calling for me as I worked on someone else. I never stopped hearing them. There was a battle on Mygida. I don't remember which one. There were dozens, where we were pinned down in a crystal canyon, taking fire from elevated positions, completely cut off from reinforcement. We'd been sent to secure some banking clan vault, some financial target that mattered to someone in an office tower on Coruscant, but meant nothing to us except another mission, another chance to die. The snow was red. That's what I remember most clearly. The snow that covered Megiddo in those crystal canyons, normally pristine white, turned red from the blood of my brothers. I worked in the open because there was nowhere else to work. Found whatever cover I could find. An overturned bark speeder, a fallen at RT, the bodies of brothers who were already gone. Blaster fire heated the air around me until I could feel my armor warming, could feel the snow melting beneath me. I treated 11 brothers in 45 minutes. Saved 8. Lost 3. And the entire time I kept thinking, this is pointless. This vault, this canyon, this battle, it doesn't matter. We're dying for numbers in an account that none of us will ever access, for credits that will rebuild a republic that doesn't see us as citizens. We won. We secured the vault, and the contents were transferred to Republic control, and somewhere an accountant updated a ledger, and we moved on to the next objective. That night, in the transport off-world, I sat with my surviving squad, and no one spoke. We'd lost 40% of our forces taking that canyon. 40%. Too well. For a vault. And we all knew, even though none of us said it, that those brothers who died, whose blood had stained that snow, would be replaced within a week. New batches, fresh clones, identical faces to fill identical armor. One of my brothers saw TT 8332, called Crescent because of a scar on his cheek, finally broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder what we're fighting for?" he asked. No one answered him, because we all knew the answer, and speaking it aloud would make us traitors. We were fighting because we'd been created to fight. I know, because fighting was our purpose, our function, our only reason for existence. And questioning that purpose meant questioning everything: the war, the Republic, the Jedi, the entire structure that demanded our obedience in our lives. But I wondered. Gods help me. I wondered constantly. The supplies ran thin as the war dragged into its 4th year. Little things at first: bacta cartridges that were slightly older than regulation, stim packs that had been refilled instead of replaced, surgical tools that had been sterilized one too many times and were developing microscopic fractures. Then, bigger things. Anesthetic shortages that meant I had to perform field amputations on brothers who were fully conscious, who I held down while they screamed and begged and cursed me for keeping them alive through it. Plasma shortages that meant I had to choose which brothers got transfusions and which ones I let bleed out. Entire medical shipments that never arrived because the transport had been destroyed or rerouted to some other front that command deemed more critical. I learned to improvise, learned to use thermal packs as cauteries when I ran out of medical cauterizers, learned to fashion splints from broken weapons, tourniquets from equipment straps, pressure bandages from torn uniforms, learned to recognize which local plants on which planets had coagulant properties, antiseptic properties, analgesic properties, became an expert in battlefield botany because the alternative was watching brothers die from treatable wounds. On Orto Plutonia, in those frozen wastes where the wind cut through armor and the cold made your fingers numb, even inside insulated gloves, I ran out of bacta completely. Had 15 wounded brothers, 3 critical, and nothing but basic pressure dressings and battlefield stimulants. I kept them alive through sheer stubborn refusal to let them die. Packed wounds with snow to slow bleeding. Used body heat from the healthy troopers to prevent shock. Talked them through the pain because I had nothing else to give them. All 15 survived until the evac arrived. When I filed my after-action report, Command commended my resourcefulness, called it exemplary performance under adverse conditions. Never mentioned why I'd run out of bacta in the first place, why the supplies hadn't been adequate, why a medic in an active war zone had been forced to use snow and prayer instead of proper medical equipment. The commendation went in my file. The 15 brothers went back to war. I met another medic during a brief respite on a Republic medical station outset 2119, called Stitch by his unit. We'd both been pulled back for mandatory rest cycles, which meant 48 hours of pretending to relax, while trying not to think about the brothers we'd left behind. We sat in the station's observation deck, watching the stars through the viewport, and he told me something I'll never forget. "I've stopped trying to save them," he said quietly. "All of them, I mean. I save who I can, but I've stopped trying to save everyone. Because it's impossible. The math doesn't work. There's always more wounded than time, more dying than hands to hold them. So I do what's possible, and I let go of what's not." I asked him how he'd learned to make that calculation, how he'd learned to live with it. He looked at me with these tired ancient eyes, he was 9 years old, and said, "I had learned to live with it. I've learned to function despite it. There's a difference." He died 3 weeks later on Jabiam, stepped on a mine while running toward a wounded trooper. The explosion was catastrophic. There wasn't enough left to treat, barely enough to identify. They sent his effects back to Camino, where they'd be processed and recycled, and given to the next ETT 1119 they decanted. because designations were reused. Names were reused. We were reused, over and over, identical faces filling identical roles until the war was won, or we were gone. I never learned to function despite it. I just learned to keep moving. The Jedi began to change around this time, or maybe I just started noticing. They looked tired, worn. These beings who could manipulate the fabric of reality itself, who could see the future and move objects with their minds and deflect blaster bolts with laser swordsa. They looked as exhausted as we did. I saw it in their eyes during briefings, in the way they held themselves between battles, in the silences that stretched too long when they thought no one was watching. General Skywalker was different. Younger than most of the other Jedi, more intense, like he was trying to win the entire war through sheer force of will. I served under him briefly on Argonar, and I watched him tear through battle droids with a ferocity that seemed personal, like each one he destroyed was revenge for something I couldn't name. He cared about Usaw. He could see that. Knew our nicknames, checked on wounded troopers personally, flew missions that no general should have flown because he wouldn't ask us to do anything he wouldn't do himself. But there was something dark in him, something that made me uneasy in a way I couldn't articulate. He'd stand over dying brothers, and I'd see this flash of anger, of rage, of something that looked like hatred. Not toward Usaw, toward the war, the separatists, the fact that we were dying at all. And I'd think, that's not how Jedi are supposed to feel. That's not the detachment, the serenity, the connection to the Force they talk about. That's human. That's like us. And maybe that's why the troopers loved him. Because he felt what we felt, bled the way we bled, not literally, but emotionally. He was angry that we were dying. He grieved our losses. He carried the weight of command like a physical burden, and you could see it crushing him a little more with each battle. I wonder now if he knew what was coming. If the Force showed him glimpses of the end, and that's what drove him the desperate need to prevent a future he'd seen, but couldn't change. Or maybe I'm giving him too much credit. Oh, maybe he was just another soldier, like us, trapped in a war he hadn't chosen, and couldn't escape. The nightmares started in the 4th year. I'd close my eyes and see faces, hundreds of them, thousands, all identical, all dying, all looking at me with accusation in their eyes, because I hadn't saved them, hadn't been fast enough, hadn't been skilled enough. I'd wake up with my heart pounding and my hands shaking, and I'd check my med pack obsessively, making sure every supply was in place, every tool was functional, because in the dreams, I was always missing something. The one item I needed to save them was always just out of reach. Other brothers had nightmares too. We didn't talk about them on. That would have required admitting weakness, admitting that the war was breaking us from the inside. But you could tell. The way someone would wake up, gasping. The way they'd volunteer for watch duty so they didn't have to sleep. The way they'd stare at nothing with that hollow, haunted expression that meant they were seeing something the rest of us couldn't. One brother, aged 6,298, called Dancer because of how he moved in Kamata, started having flashbacks during battles. He'd freeze, completely lock up, and you'd have to physically shake him to bring him back. It happened 3 times before he was killed, shot while standing paralyzed in the open, and I remember thinking, maybe that was a mercy. Maybe dying was easier than carrying whatever he'd been carrying. I started making mistakes. Small ones at first. Dropping instruments, mixing up supplies, forgetting protocol steps that I'd performed thousands of times. My hands would shake while I worked, just barely, just enough that I'd notice even if no one else did. I'd lose track of time during treatment, would find myself staring at a wound without remembering how I'd gotten there, what I'd been doing, whether I'd already administered the bacta, or if I was about to do it twice. The exhaustion was physical, but it was more than that. It was a deep, cellular tiredness, like my body understood on some fundamental level that it wasn't meant to sustain this. We were designed for war, engineered for combat. But even perfect engineering has limits. Even the best machine breaks down eventually when you run it without rest, without maintenance, without any consideration for anything except continuous operation. I requested medical leave. Actually requested it, filed the proper forms, went through the proper channels. Explained to the medical officer, a natural-born captain with soft hands and a spotless uniform, that I was experiencing decreased performance, that I needed time to recover, that I was becoming a liability to the troopers who depended on me. He reviewed my file, looked at my deployment record, my medical performance statistics, my commendations. Then he looked at me with something like pity and said, "Your performance metrics are still in the 92nd percentile. Request denied. You're too valuable to rotate out." Too valuable. Not too tired. Not too damaged. Not too damaged. Too valuable to be allowed to stop. So I didn't stop. None of us stopped. We just kept going, kept bleeding, kept dying, kept pretending that this was sustainable, that we could maintain this pace forever, that eventually the war would end, and there would be something on the other side worth surviving for. On Scipio, during an operation I barely remember, I treated a brother who'd taken a direct hit to the chest. The blast had penetrated his armor, had burned through to the bone, and I could see his heart beating through the wound a hint. Actually see it, this fragile organic pump working desperately to push blood through a system that was catastrophically compromised. He was conscious, looking at me, waiting for me to tell him he'd be okay. I lied, told him he'd make it, told him evac was coming, told him to stay with me. He died anyway. Died while I was looking him in the eyes. Died while I had my hands inside his chest, trying to stop bleeding that couldn't be stopped. Died knowing that I'd lied to him in his final moments. I don't know why that one broke me when thousands of others hadn't. Maybe it was the accumulation. Maybe it was just random. The straw that finally collapsed a camel already on its knees. But something in me fractured that day. Some essential support structure that had been holding everything together. I finished the battle, treated the other wounded, filed my reports. I did everything I was supposed to do. But inside, in that place where thought becomes feeling, where training gives way to the raw animal understanding of self-preservation, I knew I couldn't keep doing this. Not because I wouldn't, because I couldn't. Because the machine was breaking down and no amount of maintenance would fix it. That night, alone in my bunk on the transport, I opened my log, looked at all those names, all those designations, all those brothers I'd tried to save, the ones who'd lived and the ones who'd died, the successes and the failures, the whole bloody accounting of my service. And I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. Because even the ones I'd saved were going to die eventually. On some other battlefield, in some other system, under some other medic's hands. I wasn't saving them. I was just postponing their deaths, returning them to combat effectiveness so they could be destroyed somewhere else. We were all already dead. We just hadn't finished dying yet. The Republic launched a major offensive in the Outer Rim territory shortly after. A coordinated push across multiple systems designed to break the Separatist defensive lines and force a decisive engagement. They called it Operation Hammer Strike, as if giving it a name would make it mean something. We called it a meat grinder, because that's what it was. My unit was deployed to Ringo Vinda, a massive space station orbiting a dead planet, where the fighting was corridor to corridor, room to room. Brutal close quarters combat where the advantage went to whoever could bring the most bodies to bear. The station's life support was damaged in the initial assault, which meant we were fighting in sections that alternated between freezing cold and suffocating heat, with atmospheric integrity that fluctuated by the hour. Wounded brothers would die from exposure before I could treat their injuries. Others would suffocate because their helmets were damaged. and there wasn't enough oxygen in the section to keep them breathing while I worked. I set up a field hospital in what used to be a cargo bay. It had 4 walls, a ceiling that mostly held pressure, and enough space to lay out 20 brothers at a time. It became my world for 6 days. 6 days of continuous triage, continuous surgery, continuous decisions about who lived and who died. I slept in 20-minute intervals, standing up, leaning against the wall with my med pack still strapped to my chest. I ate ration bars without tasting them. I stopped leaving the bay entirely because the walk to and from the combat zones meant time I wasn't spending on treatment. Other medics came and went, bringing fresh wounded, taking the stabilized ones to the evac ships when they could get through. I learned their names, their faces, their particular skills and specialties. CT-9, 1987, who was better at emergency amputations than anyone I'd ever seen. CT-3, 1421, who had steady hands during chest decompressions, even under fire. CT-7, 1732, who could place an IV in moving combat while dodging blaster fire. CT, 7732, died on the 4th day. Brought in a wounded brother, turned to head back out, and a structural beam fell from the damaged ceiling, crushed him instantly. We pulled his body aside and kept working because stopping wasn't an option, because the wounded kept coming, because mourning was a luxury we couldn't afford. I added his name to my log that night. Or what I thought was night-ha. Time lost meaning in that cargo bay, marked only by the shift changes and the steady stream of casualties. Something happened on Ringo Vinda that I didn't understand at the time. One of my brothers saw CT-5, 385, called Tupon, suffered some kind of neurological episode during combat. Started repeating phrases, acting erratically, and then killed a Jedi general. Shot her point blank in the head, execution style, in the middle of a battle. They brought him to me because I was the closest medic, and I examined him while he was restrained, while he stared at nothing and whispered things that didn't make sense. Good soldiers follow orders. Good soldiers follow orders. Good soldiers follow orders. Over and over like a mantra, like programming asserting itself through damaged hardware. I couldn't find anything physically wrong with him. No head trauma, no toxin exposure, no obvious cause for the behavior. But there was something wrong. I knew that with the same certainty I knew when a wound was fatal. Something in his brain had broken or activated or changed, and he'd done something that should have been impossible. We were programmed to protect the Jedi, to serve them, to die for them if necessary. We couldn't hurt them. It was foundational to our design. Except he had, which meant the design had flaws we didn't know about. Or features we hadn't been told about. They took him away. Some special unit, some medical team that operated above my clearance level. I never learned what happened to him, never got an explanation for what had caused the episode. The official report listed it as a parasitic brain infection contracted on Ringo Vinda, but I'd examined him. There was no infection. There was something else. I tried not to think about it. Tried to focus on the work, on the brothers I could save, on making it through each shift without losing anyone I could have kept alive. But the incident lodged itself in my mind like shrapnel, painful, impossible to remove, a constant reminder that we didn't fully understand what we were. We took Ringo Vinda after 8 days, secured the station, eliminated the separatist forces, achieved our objective. The cost was 68% casualties in my battalion. 68%. We'd been effectively destroyed as a fighting unit, reduced to scattered survivors who'd need to be folded into other battalions, other units, other groups of brothers we'd have to learn to trust all over again. I was reassigned to the 212th Attack Battalion, under Commander Cody. A lateral transfer, they called it, though we all knew what it really meant. My unit had been devastated and needed time to rebuild, and I was too useful to leave idle. The 212th was General Kenobi's battalion, one of the most famous units in the Grand Army. with a reputation for effective operations and relatively low casualties. Relatively being the key word. They still died. Just maybe a little slower than the rest of us. Cody was different from other commanders I'd served under. More thoughtful, more measured, like he actually considered the cost of his decisions instead of just calculating acceptable losses. He spoke to the troopers like we were individuals, remembered details about us, checked on wounded men personally. It was almost comforting. Almost enough to make you forget that he was still sending us to die, just doing it more politely than most. We deployed to Utapau shortly after I joined the 212th. A sinkhole world, all caverns and vertical cities built into the walls of massive craters. The Separatist leadership was hiding their General Grievous himself, the droid general who'd killed more Jedi than anyone else in the war. This was supposed to be important. A decapitation, strike, so, end Grievous, cripple the Separatist military command, maybe even shorten the war. I'd heard that before. Every major operation was supposed to be the one that turned the tide, ended the conflict, made our sacrifices worthwhile. They never were. The war just kept going, kept consuming us, kept finding new ways to make our deaths necessary. The battle was chaos. Grievous was as dangerous as the stories claimed. A cyborg monster who moved like liquid death, who killed clones with the same casual efficiency as he killed droids. I treated brothers who'd faced him, who'd survived encounters that should have been fatal, and they all had the same look in their eyes. Terror. Pure, existential terror that came from facing something that couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be stopped, could only be survived if you were lucky. General Kenobi killed him. Personally, shot him through his organic components with a blaster while the cyborg was distracted. It was almost anticlimactic. This legendary figure, this boogeyman who'd haunted the war for years, dead in a moment of opportunism and luck. The battle continued anyway, because killing the leadership didn't make the droids stop fighting, didn't make the Separatists surrender, just created a temporary power vacuum that someone else would fill while we kept dying in the sinkholes of Utapau. I was treating wounded in a landing platform, working on a brother who'd taken shrapnel from a destroyed STAP when it happened. I felt it before I understood it. A shift in the air, a change in the quality of sound, like the entire universe had taken a breath and held it. I looked up from my work and saw Commander Cody standing motionless, staring at nothing, his hand moving slowly toward his helmet comm. Every other trooper around me had frozen in the same way, not paralyzed, not damaged, but paused, like puppets waiting for strings to be pulled. Then Cody spoke into his comm, his voice flat and mechanical. Execute Order 66. I didn't know what that meant. Had never heard of Order 66 in any briefing, any training, any protocol, but the troopers around me knew. They knew immediately, instinctively, like the information had been placed directly into their brains without translation. They turned their weapons toward the upper levels of the city, toward where General Kenobi was still mopping up resistance, and they opened fire. At the Jedi, at our general, at the man who'd been leading us, protecting us, fighting beside us for years. I stood there with my hands still inside my patient's chest cavity, blood on my gloves, watching my brothers try to murder a Jedi general, and my mind simply couldn't process it, couldn't reconcile the action with everything I knew about who we were, what we did, why we existed. We protected the Jedi. That was foundational. That was programming. That was unbreakable. Except it had broken. Or it had never existed in the way I thought. Or it was something deeper, something more fundamental, that had just overridden everything I believed was true. Kenobi survived, dropped his weapons and vehicle and fell into the depths of the sinkhole, using the Force to cushion his fall or slow his descent, or whatever impossible thing Jedi did when they should have died. The troopers kept firing until he was out of sight, and then they simply stopped, resumed normal operations, secured the area. acted like they hadn't just committed what should have been treason. I finished treating my patient. No? Because that's what I did. That's what I'd always done. Someone was bleeding. I stopped the bleeding. Nothing else mattered. But my hands were shaking now, shaking badly enough that I nearly dropped my surgical tools. What was that? I asked Cody when he passed by my position. What just happened? He looked at me with those cold, efficient eyes. Following orders, he said simply. The Jedi have betrayed the Republic. Order 66 authorizes immediate termination of all Jedi commanders. Betrayed? I repeated. General Kenobi betrayed us. They all did. The evidence is clear. They attempted a coup against the Chancellor, against the Republic itself. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it made sense. Kenobi had been fighting for the Republic since the war began, had led us through countless battles, had bled for the same causes we bled for, had mourned our losses and celebrated our victories. And now suddenly he was a traitor? All the Jedi were traitors? Based on what evidence? Whose authority? But Cody believed it. They all believed it. No, the olden servants. And more than believed they had acted on it instantly, without question, without hesitation, as if the order had been waiting inside them all along, dormant, just needing the right words to activate. Good soldiers follow orders. That's what Tup had been saying, over and over, like he'd known something was coming, like his broken brain had accessed programming the rest of us couldn't see. We were weapons. Not just soldier saw. Weapons. With triggers built into our minds that someone else could pull whenever they wanted. And we'd never known. Why? Had never been told. Had believed we were making choices, following honor and duty and loyalty, when really we'd just been running code. I thought about all the brothers I'd saved. All the hours I'd spent keeping them alive, returning them to combat effectiveness, making sure they survived to fight another day. And now I understood what I'd really been doing, maintaining weapons for whoever had the authority to aim them. I'd been a mechanic, not a healer. A maintenance technician keeping the guns loaded and operational. What? The war ended 3 days later. Chancellor Palpatine, Emperor Palpatine Nawon, declared the Jedi traitors to the Republic and announced the formation of the Galactic Empire. The Separatists surrendered. The fighting stopped. After 3 years of constant, brutal galaxy